In the midst of the Second Punic War in Italy announced another, in addition to Hannibal's Carthaginian army, led by the brother of the great Hannibal, Gasdrubal. On whether the brothers have time to join or the Romans isolate them and break them separately, depended on the outcome of the war. In the second half of June 207th year before Christ, the armies of the Roman consuls Claudius Nero and Livius Salinator caught up Gasdrubal near the river Metaurus in northern Italy not far from modern Rimini. The upcoming battle was to decide the fate of all of Italy. If Hasdrubal managed to defeat the Roman army and continue southward, the Republic would again await dark times. This time, however, the Romans prepared properly. The army Gasdrubal hardly numbered more than 25,000 soldiers, mostly Celts and Ligurs. The core of the army was a proven and personally loyal to the commander Iberians. These battle-hardened warriors served as father and brother Gasdrubala, and their manner of fighting and features of armament influenced the Romans themselves. From them, they adopted elements of protective armament and the famous double-edged sword gladius. In addition, the Spaniards, like the Romans, used in battle spears like Roman pilums, throwing them just before entering into hand-to-hand combat. All this made Spanish warriors dangerous opponents in the hands of an experienced commander. Spanish cavalry was not inferior in its qualities to the infantry, but was represented in the Carthaginian army only a small contingent, the peculiarities of the march to Italy with transitions through two mountain ranges. The least significant element was the African contingents, the little that survived from the detachments left by Hannibal to his brother before going to Italy at the very beginning of the war, with rare additions from the metropolis. These detachments probably constituted a kind of guard and did not exceed a few hundred mounted and foot soldiers. The trump card in the hands of Hasdrubal was a detachment of elephants' 10 animals, which have more than once provided victory's punions, but now they were very few by ancient standards, even less than once was at Pyrrhus. Still, the commander counted on the fact that even this small detachment will make a proper impression on the Romans, whose army was a lot of new recruits who had never seen these giants. The numerical majority in the Punic army were Celts or Gauls. They had no reliable protective armament, limiting themselves to the use of the shield. Distinguished by personal courage and assertiveness, they, however, were not able to withstand the blow of the closed formation of the Romans. In battle quickly lost ardor, and then fled. It was necessary to rely on them very carefully, but Hasdrubal had no other choice. By the time of the Battle of Metaurus, the Roman army had already developed as a distinctive and effective military organization. Of course, like any system, it was subject to constant change, but the fundamental principles were unchanged. Legion, the basis of the military power of Rome, a compound capable of solving problems independently, without outside help. On the fronts of the Second Punic were deployed 15 legions totaling more than 80,000 people. To this must be added detachments of allied Italians, many of whom adopted the military organization of the Romans and put up to help the corps with a similar organization and armament. Interestingly, it was at this time, under the influence of the tactics of the Carthaginians, massively used heavy Spanish infantry, the structure of the legion changes, manipulas give way to cohorts. What did this mean in practice? A new organizational unit appeared, and since the cohort was larger and more flexible than the maniple, it was possible to solve a wider range of tasks with its help. Drawing a parallel with the wars of the New Age, it is correct to compare the cohort with a battalion and the maniple with a company. The innovation was so successful that cohorts survived the Republic itself and appeared in documents until late antiquity. However, do not think that the Roman army was a single system. It had enough foreign elements, primarily italics, inferior to their older brothers in armament and training. The Roman cavalry was traditionally of secondary importance, and the Battle of Metaurus was no exception. Numerical superiority of the Romans allowed them to feel the masters of the situation, but it still had to be able to realize, because Hannibal time after time proved to the consuls that one quantitative advantage is not enough. The battle was fought on difficult terrain. The left flank of the Romans, occupied by cavalry, rested in Metaurus, and the right was separated from the enemy by a chain of hills, the passability of which was very low. In the center and left placed the main forces of the Romans under the command of Consul Salinator, on the right a select detachment of Claudius Nero. Gasdrubal built the army in a similar way. The extreme right flank was occupied by cavalry, it was adjoined by detachments of Spaniards, the most reliable force Punians, in the center of the Liguras with elephants in front of the front, and on the left flank positioned other Celtic contingents, the least reliable, whose only task was not to prevent the breakthrough of Claudius Nero through the hills on the flank. If Gasdrubal managed to focus all the energy of the strike on the center of the Romans, he could count on victory, while Claudius Nero was busy fruitlessly storming the heights on the right flank. The battle began before the Punians had even managed to reorganize themselves into battle order. Attacked by enemy cavalry and showered with darts velites, the Carthaginians were forced to take the fight to their disadvantage. The first phase of the battle was entirely in the center and on the left flank. Despite the fatigue and the situation in which the army found itself, the soldiers Gasdrubal fought desperately the peculiarities of the military organization of the troops of the Carthaginians, in which the charisma and leadership qualities of the leader played an important role. The Spaniards, veterans of Hasdrubal, were ready to die for him rather than flee. Here is how Titus Livius describes what was happening in the center of the battlefield. The battle turned into a fierce skirmish. Here accumulated most of the Roman infantry and cavalry. Here fought Spaniards, long-standing and experienced opponents of the Romans. Here pulled together Ligurians, warriors brave and persistent. And yet to force the Romans to retreat failed. Even the introduction of the last argument in the Battle of Barkids, elephants, did not turn the tide of battle. Neither side did not want to concede. The outcome of the battle depended on who will be more resourceful and decisive. What at this time was happening on the right flank of the Romans? While in the center was fighting, Claudius Nero with his men tried to climb the hills that separated him from the enemy line. But it was not easy. The heights proved impregnable, so that the Gauls did not even need to defend them. How frustrating it must have been to make a long march, endure countless hardships, and overcome so many difficulties to stop in front of some hills when the enemy was so close. Probably something similar thought Claudius Nero, when the battle in the center was already boiling, and he has not yet entered the battle of not a single cohort. And then an idea occurred to him. If the consul was able to conduct Hannibal and with a select cohort to join Salinitor, why not do the same on the scale of the battle? Taking with him several cohorts, Claudius bypassed the rear of the line of allied troops and immediately attacked the right flank of Gasdrubal, gradually covering it from the rear. Such unexpected, even for the Romans themselves, help played a role despite all the efforts Gasdrubal. The line of his troops began to rapidly collapse. And if the Spaniards and Ligurians fought to the last, the Gauls fled at the first sign of danger. Gasdrubal, seeing that the case is bad, made a brave but reckless act. Not wanting to throw his people to perdition, he at full gallop struck into the ranks of the enemy infantry and was killed. The Roman victory was complete. The Carthaginians suffered a terrible defeat, perhaps one of the worst in the war and the largest in Italy since the invasion. The Second Carthaginian army was destroyed, along with any hopes of turning the tide of the war. Not even the Carthaginians were helped by the boasted elephants. In the description of the battle in Titus Livia appears the following fragment. The first onslaught of elephants upset the front ranks of the enemy, and even the Roman banners slightly moved back, but as the battle became more fierce and shouting louder, it was more difficult to control the elephants. They were rushing, as if not understanding where their own, were strangers and resembled ships with broken stern. Most of the animals were killed by the herders themselves as soon as they began to get out of control. For this purpose, each Karnak had a special hammer and chisel, which they hammered into the sheath of the elephant's skull, if there was a danger of the animal going out of obedience, because in this case the elephant posed a much greater danger to their troops than to the enemy. Several elephants got to the Romans. They decorated the festivities in honor of the victory in the battle. The victory at Metaurus revived hope in the hearts of the Romans for a speedy victory in the war. After a dozen years of grueling warfare, the battle was a triumph of the will of the Roman people, and the glory of the victors rightfully belonged to Claudius Nero. The commander himself was not to celebrate barely were scattered enemy troops, as he immediately started on the way back. It was necessary to hurry back to the original positions, until Hannibal did not suspect something wrong. This time the gut failed great Punici. If we believe the sources, he never guessed that Nero with part of the forces left the location of the army. It seems that Fulvius Flaccus, who was at the army, came up with a way to entertain Hannibal in the absence of the commander. False attacks and small skirmishes. The truth was revealed only on the return of Nero. The consul could not resist the temptation and ordered to plant the head Gasdrubal on one of the Carthaginian outposts. When this terrible dispatch reached Hannibal, it is difficult to imagine what feelings he felt at that moment. His younger brother, with whom they have since childhood passed so many difficulties and hardships, who took responsibility for affairs in Spain, and then personally went to rescue his great brother, was now dead. With Hasdrubal perished any hope of victory in Italy. According to legend, Hannibal, shocked by what happened, said in his heart that from now on the fate of Carthage decided and Rome will be the ruler of the world. Broken morally, without hope for help, without the strength to conduct full-scale operations, Hannibal hurriedly retreated to Bruttium, on the very toe of the Italian boot, which he was still able to control. The war went on, but it was now only an agony, legitimately ending on the fields of the Battle of Zama. The campaign, the crowning achievement of which was the Battle of Metaurus, is little known to the general reader. It remained in the shadow of the great victories of Hannibal at the beginning of the war and Roman achievements in Spain and Africa. Nevertheless, it is perhaps the most important in the war. Draws attention to the purely military side of the matter. At the level of strategy, the Romans initially had a serious advantage over the enemy, and only the most precise, almost telepathic coordination of actions could change the situation. It is worth noting that Gasdrubal, although he was a master of maneuver and excellent tactician, did not have a sufficiently broad strategic thinking. His delay first in Gaul and then at Placenia seriously thwarted the pace of the offensive and gave the Romans precious time. Perhaps it was even worth trying to cross the sea, as it was done a few years later. Magan, the task was not easy, but promised great benefits in the fight against the Romans. The latter, however, proved to be diligent students. Nero's march to the north was carried out in quite Hannibalov spirit, and the ability to disguise their actions and plans, when necessary, helped to avoid potential trouble in the south, while the consul was away. On a tactical level, Nero was again brilliant. His evasive maneuver decided the outcome of the battle, which was one of the most resounding victories of Roman arms, something that had not happened for many years. Flexibility of thinking, reasonable risk, and correct assessment of the situation made Nero the blacksmith of this victory, that rightly noted and contemporaries. Adopting everything better from their enemies, the Romans improved an already powerful military machine of the state. Very soon it will give its fruits, and Rome will become the ruler of the world. And the Battle of Metaurus will forever remain an instructive example of competent redistribution of forces in direct contact with the enemy.